Sacred Heart Hospital in Raleigh hums with the particular silence of 0200, that hour when the building seems to hold its breath. Fluorescent lights cast everything in a shade of white that erases shadows and softens edges, making the hallways look less like a place of healing and more like the inside of a sterile vault. Brooke Sullivan moves through the ICU with the practiced invisibility of someone who has learned that attention attracts complications. 3 months. That's how long she has been working the night shift at Sacred Heart, and in that time, she has become the kind of nurse that most people forget they saw. Not because she is unremarkable, her work is meticulous, her charting immaculate, her medication counts perfect to the unit, but because she has mastered the art of being present without being noticed. She wears her hair back in a braid so tight it pulls at her temples. She keeps her voice low. She does not make eye contact unless absolutely required. She is, in every observable way, the opposite of memorable. She moves past the central nurse's station without glancing at the monitors. Room for 35. Room for 41. Room for 47. Her hands, when they move through the charts and 4 lines and medication dispensers, are steady in a way that comes from decades of muscle memory. Hands that have held trauma shears. Hands that have pressed against wounds in places where the electricity of mortar fire still hung in the air. Those hands bear white scars across the knuckles, 2 on the left, 3 on the right, thin lines that could be from a dozen different accidents if anyone bothered to ask. No one asks. She triple-checks medication dosages on the automated dispenser, verifying each vial against the electronic record, comparing against the paper chart, cross-referencing against the patient's allergies and lab values. Other nurses cut corners on the night shift. The attending physicians are asleep. The pharmacy is 3 floors down. No one notices if you skip a step. Brooke notices. She always notices. That is both her strength and, she is beginning to understand, a dangerous liability in a place where people prefer not to be seen too clearly. The ICU corridors smell like antiseptic, and something underneath it, the metallic tang of blood, faint but persistent, mingled with the fruity sweetness of acetone from the hand sanitizer stations. Her left leg carries her weight differently than her right. An old injury. A limp that disappears on days when she has had enough sleep, but today is not one of those days. Today her entire body moves with the careful precision of someone who has learned to work through pain as if it were merely information. She pauses at room 447, chart in hand, checking the post-operative vitals on the monitor above the bed. The man in the bed is intubated, sedated, his chest rising and falling in perfect mechanical sync with the ventilator. The tube at his mouth is secured with white tape. Monitors beep in a rhythm that becomes the soundtrack of intensive care. His chart reads, Lieutenant Commander Hayes, Naval Air Station Jacksonville, admitted 0640 this morning post-training accident, tension pneumothorax on arrival, emergency needle decompression and chest tube placement in trauma bay, now stabilized post-operative day 1, extubation pending neurological assessment. Brooke's finger traces the unit designation on his chart, SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon, and she stops. For a moment that lasts exactly 3 seconds, she does not move. Then she pulls her hand back and continues down the corridor as if she has read nothing at all. Her jaw clench is the only tell, and the hallway is empty. The fluorescent lights buzz overhead, a sound like insects trapped in glass. She pours coffee at 0247 from the nurse's station pot that has been sitting on the warmer since midnight. The coffee is the color of old pennies and tastes like rubber, but the caffeine is real, and that is what matters. She stands at the counter, drink untouched, reviewing the medication audit she has been conducting across the ICU's pharmaceutical dispensing system. 3 months of night shifts. 3 months of watching the medication orders, the dosages, the refills. Her meticulous attention has caught 17 discrepancies between the automated dispensing records and the controlled substance inventory log. 17 times someone has ordered quantities that do not match what the patients received. 17 times the difference has been reconciled with explanations about spillage, contamination, patient refusals. The numbers do not add up. The pattern is too clean. She has documented every inconsistency in a file on the shared drive, careful notation of dates and times and quantities, the way she was trained to document in much more dangerous circumstances. She has not mentioned it to anyone because in her experience, people who bring problems to attention are people who become problems themselves. The sound of expensive shoes on linoleum pulls her attention away from her coffee. Dr. Sterling enters the ICU at 0251, which is unusual. He is the hospital administrator, and hospital administrators do not generally work the night shift. He is a man in his early 50s who wears suits that cost more than Brooke makes in a week, and he moves through the hospital corridors like he owns the building itself, which, in a very real sense, he does. His jaw is sharp enough to cast shadows. His eyes scan the ICU with the calculating look of someone reviewing an investment portfolio. They land on Brooke, and she sees the moment of assessment. She continues to not exist in his vision. She pours the rest of her cold coffee down the sink and turns back to the medication dispensing unit, entering her credentials to access the controlled substance log. She can feel him watching. She does not look up. Sterling steps closer. He reviews the ICU patient census with a nurse manager, Sarah, who points out the critical patients, the upcoming discharges, the admissions expected in the next 6 hours. He nods at all of this with the half attention of someone whose mind is elsewhere. His eyes drift back to Brooke as she works. The surgical scars along her forearms are visible when she reaches for the top shelf of the med cabinet, white lines that crosshatch her skin in a pattern that speaks of trauma and recovery. Her left forearm bears 3 parallel scars, thin and precise. Her right bears a jagged line that curves from wrist to elbow like something tore its way out. She is wearing a faded navy scrubs jacket, the kind that most nurses wear for months until they are soft and thin. The fabric on her jacket is darker along the interior collar, worn from repeated washing. Underneath it, barely visible if you were looking, there is a patch sewn with meticulous care into the lining. The patch shows a faded image, a trident, an anchor, a flintlock pistol. SEAL Team 7, the stitching reads, though the letters have faded almost to illegibility. Sterling does not see this. He is not looking for such things. He is looking at her hands, which move through the medication cabinet with absolute precision, no hesitation, no second guessing. He is thinking, the kind of detail-oriented person who notices things that are meant to go unnoticed. He has built his position at Sacred Heart on a very specific arrangement. The hospital's pharmaceutical ordering system operates on a generous margin that allows for institutional waste. Spillage. Contamination. Patient refusals. All of these things require written justification, and justifications, when written correctly, blend seamlessly into the background noise of hospital administration. What no one is checking, not carefully, anyway, is whether the ordered quantities match what actually gets documented as waste. He has cultivated relationships with 3 board members who do not ask difficult questions about budget overages. He has cultivated relationships with pharmaceutical sales representatives who understand the value of generously inflated order totals in exchange for equipment donations and research grants that make the hospital look progressive. He has cultivated a system so elegant in its simplicity that it has generated $387,000 in unaccounted for pharmaceutical costs in the past 18 months alone. That money moves through subsidiary accounts and gets returned to him through consulting fees for work he does not perform. It is not a particularly complicated scheme. It simply requires that no one in the hospital looks too carefully at the numbers. Brooke Sullivan is looking too carefully at the numbers. He watches her complete her medication count, her documentation flawless, her numbers matching the recorded inventory with an exactitude that is frankly disturbing in a system that relies on acceptable margins of error. She has been here 3 months. He has been building this system for 6 years. He is not concerned about a night shift nurse. Not yet. But he makes a mental note to review her personnel file. He makes a mental note to understand what motivates a person to care this much about precision when no one is paying her enough to care about anything at all. He makes a mental note and he smiles, and then he turns and walks back out of the ICU without speaking to her, without acknowledging her existence in any way, which is precisely what makes the smile dangerous. She does not see the smile. She is pulling up the medication audit file on the computer, updating her documentation with tonight's counts, adding 3 more discrepancies to her growing list, utterly unaware that the man who just walked past her has just decided she needs to disappear. Brooke checks on Hayes again at 0320. The ventilator wheeze has become a sound she hears without hearing it, the background noise of his sleep and recovery. She adjusts the flow rate to his 4, verifies that the line is free of infiltration, checks the dressing on his chest tube to confirm no signs of infection or air leak. His oxygen saturation sits at 94%. His heart rate is steady at 68. His blood pressure is holding at 118/72. Every vital sign says he is exactly where a post-operative SEAL should be. She does not understand why he is here, in her ICU, why the Navy SEAL Team 3 Charlie platoon commander is lying in a bed recovering from a training accident instead of doing whatever it is that Navy SEALs do when they are not learning to become more broken. She has not researched him. She has not looked beyond the chart. She has not allowed herself the indulgence of curiosity about the man who commanded the Tikrit operation, the operation that made Senior Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan cease to exist as an officially recognized human being. If she allowed herself to think about the particular timing of this particular patient in this particular hospital, she would have to confront the question of how much coincidence one person is expected to withstand before coincidence becomes something else entirely. So she does not think about it. She documents his vitals. She notes his stable status. She moves on to the next patient, to the next medication count, to the next hour of night shift work in a hospital where she is nobody at all. The file on Sterling's desk contains everything. Employee file. Background check. Academic records. Medical licensing verification. 3 months of shift schedules and call-in history. Perfect attendance. Perfect performance reviews from the previous 3 shifts. No incidents. No complaints. No visible history. The file is aggressively, suspiciously clean. He reads through it in his office at 0403, after he has returned to his administrative suite on the hospital's executive level, in a room that costs more per month to maintain than Brooke makes in salary. What he is looking for is a vulnerability, a leverage point, a weakness in the system that produced this remarkably unremarkable nurse. What he does not find is any indication that she is anything other than what she appears to be, a quiet woman with no family connections listed, no emergency contacts of significance, no obvious leverage that would allow him to control her or remove her. He closes the file. He opens his email. He begins drafting a message to the pharmaceutical sales representative who has been particularly generous with his consulting fees, a man named Vasquez who understands how hospitals actually function versus how they pretend to function. He begins the message with a single line, "I may need a favor regarding a personnel matter. When can you visit?" What he does not see, what he cannot possibly see from his executive suite 3 floors above the ICU, is that the woman who works the night shift with hands like surgical lasers and a memory for numbers that borders on inhuman has already documented every discrepancy in his system. What he does not see is that she has been keeping records. What he does not see is that in approximately 96 hours, her quiet efficiency is going to become the most dangerous thing that has ever happened to him, and by then it will be far too late to correct course. The moment he decided she was a liability, he made the single most catastrophic error of his career. But that moment has not yet arrived. Right now, at 0403 on a Tuesday morning in Raleigh, he is still operating under the assumption that he is the predator in this equation, and she is nothing more than an obstacle to be removed. The cafeteria at Sacred Heart smelled like industrial coffee and something else, something that turned Brooke's stomach before she even sat down. Disinfectant. Sterling stood by the resident cluster near the east windows, his voice carrying the particular timbre of a man who knew no one would tell him to lower it. $20 as the mouse quits within a week, he said, gesturing vaguely toward the nursing stations. She's too timid for real medicine. Too careful. Medicine needs confidence, not. He paused, letting the silence do the work. Caution. The residents laughed. It was the kind of laughter that travels, that makes other people turn to see what's funny so they can participate even if they don't know the joke. Brooke sat 3 tables away, her sandwich a neat triangle on a tray that held an apple and a cup of water with exactly 4 ice cubes. She ate alone most days. That was fine. Alone meant no conversation. No questions about where she'd worked before. No stories expected. No need to construct a life that didn't exist. She'd become skilled at the architecture of invisible people. She knew the weight of a glance that landed on her and then moved away. She knew how to sit in a room and become furniture. Sterling's shoes made a specific sound on the tile floor, expensive leather, not the rubber-soled shoes that sensible doctors wore in hospitals. Click, click, click. His trajectory was taking him past her table. Brooke kept her hand steady on her tray. Pain is data, her old instructor had said in that concrete building outside Tikrit. Every sensation is information. Use it. She could feel him approaching the way a sailor feels a storm changing direction. He accidentally bumped her elbow as he passed. The tray went vertical. The sandwich, carefully assembled that morning in her apartment, tomato and turkey and mustard, scattered across the tile in an arc that looked almost ballistic. The apple rolled under the table. The water cup didn't break, but it spilled in a precise geometric pattern across the floor, spreading like something alive. Several residents turned to watch. One of them pulled out a phone. Brooke could hear the camera shutter sound. "Careful, mouse," Sterling said, his voice a smile she could hear without looking at his face. "Those reflexes need work." Brooke took one measured breath. Then another. She rose from her seat and bent to gather the scattered food and broken tray. A single tear escaped her left eye before she could stop it, not from sadness, not from fear, but from the kind of pressure that builds in certain spaces of the body when rage and restraint occupies the same room. She wiped it away with the back of her hand without breaking eye contact with the floor tile. When she straightened, her voice came out like still water, flat, controlled, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. "I've cleaned up worse, doctor." The residents fell quiet. One of them exchanged a glance with another. Sterling's expression tightened for precisely 1 second before he recovered, turning his body away as if he'd already forgotten she existed. But he hadn't. Brooke could feel it. He was already recalculating, already planning. She'd just made herself from obstacle to threat. That afternoon, she brought him the medication discrepancy report. 3 phantom pharmaceutical orders. Broad-spectrum antibiotics that didn't match any patient charts. Cardiovascular drugs in quantities that couldn't be explained by the census. The numbers had been easy to find once she'd started looking properly, easy because Sterling had been sloppy, because he'd assumed no one would care enough to actually count. $47,000. She'd double-checked the math 3 times. She'd verified the patient files. She'd printed it on hospital letterhead and signed her name. Sterling's office smelled like leather and something chemical, cologne or aftershave, the kind expensive men wore to cover the smell of their own skin. He was at his desk when she knocked. He didn't look up. "The medication orders in your recent requests," Brooke said, her voice the same still water as before. 3 entries don't match patient census." He looked up then. His eyes moved from the report she was holding to her face, and she saw the calculation happen, the moment he understood that she wasn't going to pretend, that she wasn't going to let this go, that she was the kind of person who kept looking even after it would have been easier to stop. "Give me that," he said. She extended the report. He took it. Then he stood, walked around the desk, and threw the chart at her feet. Paper scattered across the tile like snow. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, his voice a specific kind of venom. "And next time, stay in your lane. You're a nurse, not an auditor. You count bandages. You take temperatures. You don't count pills and don't ask questions about doctor's orders. Do you understand me?" Brooke knelt slowly, gathering the pages back into their order. The paper was thin, expensive, Sterling probably had them printed at some custom place. She could feel him standing above her, waiting for her to break. Waiting for the apology. Waiting for the submission that would tell him she understood the hierarchy and her place in it. When she'd gathered all the pages and straightened, her voice came out the same way. "I've survived worse men than you, doctor." It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact. She'd held a man's intestines in her hands in a field hospital while rounds came in from the desert outside. She'd performed CPR on someone who'd already been dead for 4 minutes, pressing on their chest while blood went somewhere warm. She'd watched people die because supplies didn't arrive. She'd watched them live because she pushed harder. She'd survived men with guns. She'd survived men with authority. She'd survived men with both. Sterling's face changed color. Not red, that would have been crude. But something happened behind his eyes. Something that looked like recognition of a kind he didn't understand yet. He turned away without speaking. She left the chart on his desk and walked out. By Thursday morning, the nursing station felt different. Brooke could smell it first, that particular shift in air pressure that happens when people have decided something about you. She noticed it in the way Supervisor Chen stopped talking when she approached. In the way the pharmacy director, who usually nodded at her, suddenly became very interested in his computer screen. In the way a memo appeared in her locker, investigation into scope of practice concerns. Please contact HR for interview. 3 separate investigations. Anonymous tip to the State Nursing Board. A complaint from the pharmacy director about harassment over inventory. A formal written warning in her file for unprofessional conduct and overstepping boundaries. It had taken Sterling less than 48 hours to activate his network. Brooke understood networks. She'd operated in them. She knew how threads connected to people, people connected to favors, favors connected to silence. That afternoon, she found herself alone in the locker room, her fingers tracing the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining. A trident. Delta. The call sign of an operation that no longer officially existed. She sat on the bench and let her hands be steady on her knees because that's what steady hands did. They held instruments. They held other people's lives. They didn't shake. A nursing supervisor she'd never spoken to found her there. Sandra. 30 years at Sacred Heart. She'd seen things. She pulled the locker room door closed behind her. "I don't know what Sterling's angle is," Sandra said quietly, "but watch your back. He's got the board in his pocket. Morrison, the pharmacy director, probably Judge Hartwell through some country club thing. Whatever you did, he can bury it. You understand?" Brooke nodded slowly. "Hayes. The seal in for 47. He's scheduled for extubation tomorrow morning." "I know. Sterling's moving it. Next week. Different doctor. Dr. Chen from the day shift." The room went very still. Brooke could hear the fluorescent lights humming above them, that particular electrical sound that most people learn to ignore. She didn't ignore it. She registered it. Catalogued it. Added it to the growing list of things that didn't add up. "Thank you," Brooke said. That evening, she stood in front of the ramen aisle at the discount grocery store downtown, her paycheck already calculated down to its component pieces: rent, her son's school fees, gas, the phone bill. The photo of her and her son before her last deployment was in her wallet. She'd taken it out twice that week. Looked at their faces. Put it back. She wasn't hungry, but hunger wasn't the point. The point was that Sterling was still operating under the assumption that she was something he could break. The point was that Hayes was upstairs in a hospital bed, alive because of her, and about to be moved away from her because of Sterling's control of the machinery that ran Sacred Heart. The point was that Brooke Sullivan had spent 6 years as a ghost. She'd buried herself so completely that no one at that hospital knew what she'd been. No one had any idea who was working their night shift, saving their patients, fixing their mistakes. She'd let it happen. She'd chosen it. But choices changed. And the moment she brought that report to Sterling's office, she'd made a new one. She selected a package of ramen and went to the checkout. The night shift at Sacred Heart began like every other night, fluorescent lights humming their white noise frequency, the ICU monitors beeping their steady mechanical hearts. Brooke had worked 17 nights straight without mentioning it. The scheduling system had two glitches, both in Sterling's favor. Nobody noticed. She was clocking in at 2,145 hours when the charge nurse, Janet, pulled her aside with the look of someone delivering bad news wrapped in administrative language. "You're not on the 4th floor tonight," Janet said, not meeting her eyes. Sterling specifically requested, well, he didn't request, exactly. He ordered that you be reassigned to post-surgical recovery. 3rd floor. Brooke didn't ask why. She'd learned that questions at Sacred Heart came with the same cost as a sandwich hitting tile, public and humiliating. She'd learned it well. Instead, she simply nodded and adjusted her assignment card, her movements precise as a field medic sorting triage. Her jaw tightened just enough that only someone trained to read micro-expressions would have noticed. She didn't ask why. She already knew. 3 floors away from room 447. 3 floors away from the patient whose monitor she'd been tracking since his admit, whose chest x-ray she'd reviewed at 0030 hours when the night was still young and the hospital still believed in sleep. She'd seen the early signs of pleural pressure in his left lung, nothing critical yet, but the kind of thing that demanded watching. The kind of thing that could change in minutes if the ICU nurse missed one rhythm strip, one saturation dip, one small warning sign. The kind of thing Sterling had just made sure she wouldn't see. She moved to the 3rd floor without protest, understanding the architecture of her own destruction. Sterling had been busy. That much was clear now. The medication report she'd delivered had accelerated something. She'd brought him evidence. He'd thrown it at her feet. And she'd done something worse than stand up to him, she'd looked him in the eye without flinching. That was the real insult. Not the chart-hitting tile. Not the condescension. The fact that she hadn't broken. At 2,230 hours, while Brooke was checking vitals on a post-surgical abdominal patient, Sterling's office phone rang through to board chairman Morrison. Morrison had answered on the second ring, men like Morrison always did when the caller ID showed someone they owed money to. Except it wasn't money. It was a buried malpractice complaint from 2019. A patient death that had been settled quietly. A death that Morrison had been told would stay quietly settled as long as his voting patterns remained aligned with Sterling's financial interests. "The Sullivan nurse," Sterling said, his voice smooth as refined oil. "We need to discuss her employment file." Morrison's response was inaudible through the phone line, but Sterling smiled. The smile of a man who understood leverage the way a conductor understands an orchestra. He'd spent 6 years building a network of favors disguised as friendships, obligations wrapped in the language of professional courtesy. He controlled 3 board members outright. The state nursing board inspector owed his daughter's medical school acceptance to a letter of recommendation Sterling had written. The hospital security chief had a gambling problem that Sterling's associates had helped finance, at favorable interest rates. Brooke finished her post-surgical rounds at 0015 hours. Mrs. Chen in bed 3 was recovering well from her hip replacement. Mr. Rodriguez's flow was flowing smoothly. Everything was stable. Everything was documented. Everything was exactly as it should be. She moved through the floor like a ghost in Scrubs, her movements economical, her presence unnoticed, which was precisely how she'd learned to exist in a world that didn't know what to do with her. She had survived worse men than Sterling. She had held the bleeding bodies of men worse than Sterling while helicopters screamed overhead. She had watched men worse than Sterling bleed out on surgical tarps in field hospitals outside Tikrit, and she had saved every single one of them that she could. Sterling's phone call to the state nursing board came at 0047 hours, routed through an anonymous line, the kind that cost $300 for a burner account and the kind that Sterling didn't have to pay for because he knew people. The inspector who answered was familiar with anonymous concerns. They came in daily, most of them baseless, most of them motivated by spite or gossip. But this one had a specific quality. Specific dates. Specific times. Allegations that Brooke had violated protocol during her evening shifts, had administered medications without proper physician verification, had failed to flag discrepancies in the pharmaceutical ordering system. The last one was particularly clever. It was true that she'd noticed discrepancies. It was true that she'd flagged them. But Sterling had positioned it as a failure. She should have caught them sooner, and by failing to catch them sooner, she'd violated protocol. The logic was inverted enough to require investigation. The truth was malleable that way. It always was. By 0100 hours, Sterling had instructed hospital security to flag her personnel file with a note, pending investigation, employment verification. Do not allow access to restricted areas. Terminate immediately upon completion of night shift. The language was clinical. The intent was surgical. He was removing her systematically, using the very hospital that paid her as the instrument of her own erasure. But what Sterling had miscalculated, what men like Sterling always miscalculate, was that he'd set the timeline himself. He'd scheduled Hayes's extubation for 0600 hours, which meant Hayes would be removed from the ICU just after Brooke's shift ended. Just after she was fired. Just after she was already gone. The logic was beautiful in its cruelty. Remove her from the floor. Fire her. Then remove the patient she cared about. No one would ever know that the two events were connected because there would be no one left to know her well enough to ask the question. At 01 for 5 hours, Brooke noticed that Hayes's extubation order had appeared in the system. She was stocking supplies on the 3rd floor when Janet stopped by, looking uncomfortable. Physician order came through, Janet said quietly. Hayes's extubation got moved up to 0600. Sterling signed it at 2330 hours. That's not good, Brooke said. The words came out flat, clinical. His X-ray at 0030 showed early pleural pressure, moving him before his lungs stabilize. I know. Janet's voice was just above a whisper. I know. But it's an order. Brooke returned to stocking the medication cart with the precision of someone who had learned that precision was all she had left. She counted doses. She verified labels. She moved through the motions of a nurse who no longer had a choice, because that's what Sterling had taken from her, not her job, not yet. But her agency. Her ability to protect. The one thing that had kept her alive in Tikrit, the ability to make decisions when everyone else froze, had been stripped away by a man in an expensive watch who didn't even know her name. The electrical fire started in the ICU's main panel at 0200 hours exactly. The timing felt almost too precise, almost too convenient, the kind of coincidence that only existed in movies and court cases. But fires didn't care about convenience. They cared about faulty wiring and overloaded circuits and the kind of deferred maintenance that happened when a hospital's budget was being quietly siphoned into a doctor's offshore account. The smoke alarm erupted like a scream. The sound cut through the hospital's nighttime hum, a piercing wail that made even the sleeping patients open their eyes. Fluorescent lights flickered. The intercom came to life with a voice that had practiced this scenario exactly 0 times. Code red, 4th floor ICU. All staff evacuate per protocol. This is not a drill. Evacuate immediately. Brooke was moving before the message finished. She didn't think. She didn't hesitate. Her body had already decided. Her feet were already moving toward the stairwell while every other nurse and orderly on the 3rd floor moved toward the stairwell going down. She was the only one going up. The only one moving against the current of evacuation, against the logic of self-preservation, against every protocol that had been drilled into her during her 12 years of service. A security guard grabbed her arm as she passed. Wrong way. Evacuate. Now. She met his eyes for exactly 1 second. The second was enough. Whatever he saw in her face, whatever muscle memory and command authority hadn't been entirely erased by 3 months of invisibility, made him let go. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She just moved, taking the stairs 2 at a time despite the chronic ache in her left knee, the injury that had nearly ended her career before she'd traded one uniform for scrubs. The smell hit her first as she reached the 4th floor. Electrical smoke. Not the sweet acrid smell of standard fire, but the sharp metallic scent of burning components, burning wires, burning insulation that contained chemicals with names that looked like alphabet soup. The kind of smell that meant serious infrastructure damage. The kind of smell that meant the fire wasn't small or contained or anything approaching manageable. The ICU hallway was chaos wearing the mask of organization. Nurses wheeling patients toward the exits in a choreography of emergency protocols. Doctors shouting vitals to each other. The sound of ventilators being switched to manual operation. The beep 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 of monitors carried by staff moving at a controlled run. The pneumatic hiss of doors opening and closing. The crackle of radio static as hospital security coordinated the evacuation through their equipment. Room 447's door was closed. Not evacuated. Not yet. Still occupied. Through the fourth-floor window at the far end of the hallway, Brooke could see Sterling in the parking lot below, already clear, already safe, already checking his watch as if he had somewhere else to be. He didn't look back at the hospital. He didn't look back at the patients he'd sworn an oath to serve. He looked only at his watch and then at his phone, and his face had the satisfied expression of a man whose plan was proceeding exactly as designed. Brooke pushed through the smoke that was beginning to fill the corridor, the visibility dropping by the second. She grabbed a towel from a supply cart, whipped it from a sink, tied it around her face. The fabric was damp and chemical tasting and barely functional, but it would buy her time. How much time, she didn't know. But in Tikrit, she'd operated on minutes. Sometimes on seconds. She could operate on whatever time she had left. The electrical panel was visible from the hallway, flames climbing the wall like something alive, like something hungry. Heat radiating outward, distorting the air itself. The fire alarm continued its mechanical screaming. The overhead announcement repeated its evacuation order for the third time, the automated voice growing increasingly desperate in its synthetic way. Room 447's door opened without resistance. The inside was still clear, still protected by its walls, but not for long. The smoke was finding its way under the doorframe. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, steady and oblivious to the danger. Hayes's oxygen saturation read 94 on the monitor. Borderline acceptable. But she could hear something in that ventilator rhythm that the machines hadn't caught yet. A sound that meant something had shifted in his lung capacity. The sound of pressure beginning to build. The sound that said his remaining lung was starting to collapse. She didn't stop to check his chart. She didn't stop to verify orders or protocols or any of the things that she was supposed to do. She stopped because her hands moved on their own, because muscle memory overrode training, because something deeper than reason understood that this man was about to stop breathing and she had maybe 2 minutes before the choice was taken from her. The monitor alarmed. Saturation dropping. 92, 88, 85, falling fast. The kind of fall that meant tension pneumothorax, pressure building inside the chest cavity, collapsing the lung, pressing on the heart. The kind of emergency that required immediate decompression or death. She tied the wet towel tighter around her face and reached for the equipment she didn't have access to, because some protocols were meant to be broken, and some oaths were older than hospital policy. The fire was visible now through the window behind her. Real. Close. Hungry. Alarms shattered the night at 0200 hours. Not the soft beeping of routine monitors. Not the measured tones of scheduled alerts. This was the sound of chaos, the ventilator's distress shriek, the electrical fire's hiss and crackle, the rapid-fire warning systems designed to wake the dead because the living had seconds to move. Smoke poured into the ICU like water filling a sinking ship, thick and grey and choking, carrying the smell of burning insulation and melted plastic. The electrical fire had started in the wall behind bed 4, spreading laterally through the conduit system before anyone noticed the temperature climbing. By 0203, the entire ICU corridor was filling. The overhead sprinklers had activated 30 seconds too late. Staff scattered. That was the protocol: evacuate, move to the stairwell, let the firefighters handle what humans couldn't outrun. Dr. Chen shouted evacuation commands. Two nurses grabbed the hemodynamically stable patients. A resident wheeled the dialysis patient toward the exit. The evacuation system worked exactly as designed, except for one problem. Room 447 still had a patient intubated on full mechanical ventilation who couldn't walk. Hayes was supposed to be extubated this morning at 0600. Sterling had moved it up from the original post-op timeline, rescheduled it twice in 2 days. Brooke had seen the orders and understood them for what they were: a strategic removal of her access, a calculation that if Hayes couldn't breathe on his own and Brooke wasn't here to catch what went wrong, the responsibility would fall somewhere else. Somewhere safe. Somewhere that didn't connect back to Sterling's desk. But at 0200 hours, Hayes was still on a ventilator. Still intubated. Still dependent on machines and the people running them. Brooke was running toward the smoke when the rest of the floor was running away. Her limp was pronounced now, 48 hours of standing on a broken ankle making every step a negotiation with her own body, but her mind had already moved past the pain. Pain is data. Pain tells you where damage exists, and Brooke had learned in a field hospital outside Tikrit that you file that data away and keep moving. The fire's heat rolled through the corridor like a physical presence, the kind of intense dry warmth that strips moisture from your lungs and makes thinking harder. Room for 47. 12 meters ahead. Through the smoke now, visibility maybe 3 feet. She pushed through the door and found Hayes exactly where she'd left him at 2200 hours, supine on the bed, sedated, chest moving with the mechanical rhythm of the ventilator. Except something was wrong. His chest wasn't moving symmetrically. The left side was rising with each breath cycle, but the right side, his right side, where his original pneumothorax had collapsed, that lung, barely moved at all. Asymmetrical chest rise. Decreased breath sounds on the right. The pulse ox was dropping. Tension pneumothorax. His collapsed lung was being compressed by positive pressure from the ventilator, building pressure inside his chest cavity, pushing his heart and great vessels off midline. In minutes, his cardiac output would collapse. In 5 minutes, he'd arrest. No evacuation team was coming to this room. The hallway was now opaque with smoke. The fire was between her and Hayes and the exit she'd come through. Brooke moved. Muscle memory took over, the kind of neural pathways that don't require thinking because they've been burned into your nervous system through repetition and survival. She went to the crash cart, pulled open the medication drawer, and found what she needed: a 14-gauge needle, the largest bore that would fit between ribs without tearing tissue. Her hands didn't shake. That was something Sterling would never understand about combat training. The people who'd learned to operate in mortal danger didn't shake when they needed to move. She counted ribs by touch through Hayes's gown. Second intercostal space, midclavicular line, the textbook location, but more importantly, the location she'd learned by doing this exact procedure in a field hospital with artillery overhead and patients coding on the table. She palpated the rib, found the groove above it, and advanced the needle perpendicular to the chest wall. The resistance lasted maybe 2 centimeters before she felt it, that subtle change in pressure that meant she'd breached the pleura. The hiss of air escaping sounded like a whisper at the end of the world. She withdrew the needle, left the catheter in place, and watched Hayes's oxygen saturation climb on the monitor. 72. 79. 86. His blood pressure stabilized. His heart rate dropped from the elevated rate that indicated shock. "Stay with me," she said, though he was sedated and couldn't hear her. Just like Tikrit. The ventilator's alarm stopped shrieking. The immediate crisis was averted. The fire, however, had spread. Brooke disconnected the ventilator from the endotracheal tube, grabbed a bag mask unit from the crash cart, and began manually ventilating Hayes, squeezing the bag with her left hand while keeping her right on his chest, feeling the resistance of his lungs filling, the feedback loop between her hands and his breathing that was as old as emergency medicine itself. Her shoulder screamed. The limp in her left leg made standing difficult. The smoke was getting thicker, the heat more intense. Hayes's body weight was 190 pounds. His unconscious mass made him effectively dead weight, the kind of load that couldn't be dragged or coaxed or negotiated with. He had to be carried. She positioned herself alongside the bed, set down the bag mask unit for a critical 5 seconds, and wrapped her arms around his torso. Her legs bent. Her back straightened. She deadlifted him the way she deadlifted ammunition crates and wounded Marines and sandbags for barriers outside the FOB. She carried him in a fireman's carry, one arm beneath his shoulders, one beneath his knees, his intubated face inches from her own, his ventilator tubing trailing against her scrubs. The smoke was so thick now that she couldn't see her feet. Navigation became a matter of memory. She'd walked these corridors 1,000 times, knew the distance from 447 to the stairwell by the turn of her shoulders, the distance to the exit by the number of steps her muscle memory counted. 6 meters. 8. The heat was so intense that sweat was pouring down her face, into her eyes, making her vision blur. Her lungs felt like they'd been coated with ash. The limp that had been manageable suddenly felt crippling, weight transfer becoming agony, her left ankle screaming with every step. 12 meters. The stairwell door appeared through the smoke like a revelation. She hit it with her shoulder, and suddenly firefighters in full protective equipment were there, the sound of their SCBA units' regulators hissing, their voices muffled behind masks, the coordinated movement of people trained for exactly this kind of chaos. Gloved hands reached for Hayes. Professional voices, "We've got him, let's move." Brooke transferred him to the firefighter's arms, her grip opening reluctant to release. She sank back against the wall as they descended the stairwell with Hayes, the bag mask unit now in the firefighter's hands, protocol taking over where desperation had been. She coughed. Her lungs expelled smoke in thick grey exhalations that tasted like metal and burning plastic. Her vision swam. Her ankle throbbed in rhythm with her heartbeat, a reminder that bodies break down under load. By 0700 hours, Hayes was stable in a transfer ICU 2 buildings over, his collapsed lung re-expanded, his pneumothorax managed, his prognosis transformed from critical to guarded. By 0800, Brooke had showered the ash from her skin and changed into clean scrubs. By 0900, she was summoned to Sterling's office. The door opened to find him behind his desk like a general in his command post, 3 board members flanking him, Morrison among them, his face arranged in an expression of grave concern. A security guard stood by the wall holding a cardboard box. "Brooke," Sterling said, his voice modulated with practiced sympathy. "Thank you for coming in." She didn't sit. She stood in the doorway like a soldier before a firing squad, already understanding what was about to happen. The termination letter sat on his desk, the pages crisp and official, legal language designed to protect the hospital from any suggestion that this firing was retaliation. "Last night you violated direct orders," Sterling said, sliding the letter across his desk. "You were explicitly told to remain at your station during evacuation protocols. Instead, you entered a contaminated area without authorization, without backup, and without following chain of command. That's insubordination. It's reckless endangerment of hospital property and personnel." Morrison added, his voice grave, "The State Board has already been notified. We're documenting a pattern of unauthorized patient contact and violation of scope of practice." The third board member said nothing, just studied Brooke's face with the expression of someone witnessing something they didn't quite understand. Sterling continued, "There's also the matter of your falsified employment records. We found irregularities. Missing references. A gap in your background that doesn't add up. Security is investigating how you were hired in the first place." The security guard stepped forward and held out the cardboard box. Inside was her cracked mug, the one that read "World's Okayest Nurse" in fading letters. The dying succulent she kept on the windowsill of her apartment, brought in because it needed light and she'd thought maybe the ICU window would help it. And a photograph, 5 by 7, showing her in dress uniform standing beside her teenage son, both of them smiling in front of the naval base, taken 6 years ago before her last deployment. Before she was supposed to disappear. Brooke took the box. One measured breath. Not because she was afraid, but because the world had just contracted to the size of this room, and she understood with crystalline clarity that Sterling had accomplished what he'd set out to do. He'd calculated that the fire would serve as perfect cover, that her heroics would be reframed as insubordination, that the network of board members and regulators he'd already activated would move quickly while the crisis was fresh. She should have been afraid. Instead, she was angry in the way that comes after grief, the quiet fury of someone who'd already lost so much that losing a job felt almost absurd. One tear escaped. Just one. She didn't try to hide it, didn't look away, just let it track down her cheek while her eyes remained locked on Sterling's. When she spoke, her voice had changed. Not louder. Quieter, actually, the kind of quiet that makes you lean in to hear it, the kind of quiet that carries absolute certainty. "You don't know who you're standing next to," she said. Sterling's face flickered. Something in her voice had triggered a warning, the instinctive response of a predator recognizing something dangerous. But she was already turning away, already walking toward the door, the cardboard box heavy in her arms. Behind her, Sterling called out, "Brooke, wait," but his voice had lost its certainty. By evening, she was sitting at a rain-soaked bus stop in Raleigh, the cardboard box on her lap, watching water blur the Sacred Heart Hospital logo printed on the side. Rain hammered down like bullets on a tin roof, each drop adding to the accumulation that had turned the bus stop's bench into a temporary stream. She'd called her son to tell him she'd been fired. She hadn't mentioned the fire. She hadn't mentioned Hayes. Those were compartments she'd locked down, memories she'd trained herself not to access because accessing them meant remembering the operation, remembering Tikrit, remembering the moment she'd made the choice to stay behind so 16 operators could extract. The rain kept falling. The logo kept blurring. And Brooke sat in the darkness and wondered if disappearing had been worth it at all, if 6 years of living small and quiet and hidden had purchased anything except another kind of invisibility, the kind that didn't come with medals or salutes or the understanding that you'd saved lives. The bus pulled up. She picked up the box. Her hands were steady as a surgical laser, the way they always were. That was something that would never change, no matter how much the world took from her. That training lived in her nervous system now, burned into muscle and bone and the way she moved through space. She didn't know that in less than 18 hours, her son would be walking into a hospital board meeting with a shadow box of medals. She didn't know that Hayes, still intubated in a transfer ICU, had been leaving messages with his commanding officer every 6 hours since the fire, describing the woman who'd carried him through smoke with the same precision and calmness she'd used in a field hospital 6 years ago. She didn't know that the Navy had been looking for her. That her disappearance had never quite taken, had always been a wound that wouldn't heal, because the kinds of heroes she was didn't actually disappear, they just waited. The bus door closed behind her. Raleigh's rain fell on the empty bench. And in a transfer ICU 2 miles away, a Navy SEAL was asking his commanding officer to call everyone he knew. The conference room at Sacred Heart fell silent when the door opened and a 16-year-old boy walked in carrying a shadow box. His hands trembled as he stepped toward the table of hospital administrators, each one turning in their chairs to face him. The boy was slight, dark-haired, with eyes that held a steadiness beyond his years. Inside the glass case he held were medals, ribbons in colors that meant nothing to these people yet. Colors that were about to change everything. "My mother was told never to surface," the boy said, his voice cracking slightly. "But you need to see these." The board members exchanged confused glances. Morrison, the board chairman, leaned forward. "Son, I'm not sure you understand where you are. This is a private hospital meeting." Lieutenant Commander Hayes rolled his wheelchair forward from the corner of the room, his shoulders still broad despite weeks of ICU sedation. His voice emerged hoarse but iron-steady, the kind of voice that had given orders to men in valleys 6,000 miles away. "That nurse saved my life. The one you fired yesterday. You need to know who she is." The hospital attorney, a woman whose hands had already begun shaking, opened a manila folder. Her eye scanned the pages, and her face went pale. She read aloud, each word falling like a gavel, Senior Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan. Silver Star for Valor. Navy Cross. 3 Purple Hearts. She paused, unable to continue. The silence was absolute. You could hear the hum of the fluorescent panels overhead, the distant beep of monitors down the hall, the soft click of Hayes's wheelchair brake. The conference room doors opened again. A woman in Navy dress blue stepped inside, Commander Patricia Vance, SEAL Team 3's commanding officer, her uniform bearing the insignias of a woman who had led men through impossible terrain. She moved to the center of the table with the kind of presence that made the air pressure shift. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of Tikrit, the dust of forward operating bases, the memory of operators who had come home only because of one person's decision to stay behind. Senior Chief Sullivan ran 11 combat rescues under fire in Helmand and Anbar provinces, Vance said. She trained half the corpsmen in our theater. And when our operation was compromised in 2018, she stayed behind so 16 operators could extract. We've been looking for her for 6 years. Vance's jaw tightened. You fired her. For doing her job. Morrison's face had gone the color of old coffee. The board members were pushing back in their chairs now, creating distance, as if what was happening was contagious. One of them, Hendricks, who had nodded along when Sterling pitched his efficiency improvements, was already pulling his phone from his pocket. The FBI agent by the door stepped forward. 2 more agents moved silently into position, flanking the entrance like they were expecting someone to run. The first agent's voice was flat and professional. Dr. James Sterling is wanted for federal health care fraud totaling $2.3 million, false billing, and kickback schemes involving pharmaceutical suppliers across 6 states. We have him under arrest. Sterling. The name hung in the air for exactly 3 seconds before chaos erupted. Sterling stood up so fast his chair scraped backward with a sound like a scream. This is insane. This is a misunderstanding. Morrison, tell them about our arrangement. Tell them it was perfectly legal. Morrison's face hardened into something that looked like stone. I have no idea what you're talking about, James. The color drained from Sterling's face in real time. You could watch it happen, the dawning realization that the people he'd threatened, cajoled, and blackmailed were now rats abandoning ship. His phone buzzed. Then again. Then continuously, a steady percussion of messages from other doctors in his scheme, all of them hitting delete, all of them lawyering up. The hospital attorney closed the classified folder with deliberate care. When she spoke, her voice shook but held. Dr. Sterling, hospital counsel can no longer represent you in this matter. An FBI agent's hand came down on Sterling's shoulder, not violent, just firm, and he sat back down. The gesture was gentle but absolute. This was authority that didn't need to raise its voice. The security guard who had handed Brooke her cardboard box the morning before, the same guard who had watched her walk out of Sacred Heart with her cracked mug and dying succulent and photograph, now stepped forward with an identical box. This one was heavier. His voice was flat and held a satisfaction he wasn't bothering to hide. Your personal effects, Dr. Sterling. I believe you know the way out. Inside that box, a fake Rolex watch that had never fooled anyone, a monogrammed pen set with initials engraved in pretentious script, a photograph of Sterling with a state senator at a charity gala, connections that meant absolutely nothing now. The kind of trophy case of a man who had built nothing but lies. Hayes spoke from his wheelchair, his voice steady despite the weeks of sedation still working out of his system. You risked lives for money. She risked her life for mine. Vance added, her tone carrying the weight of military protocol. The Navy will be providing full documentation to the U.S. Attorney's Office to support criminal prosecution under the False Claims Act. 2 agents guided Sterling toward the door. His expensive shoes, Italian leather that had walked these halls with arrogance, clicked against tile as he was escorted out. Past nurses who wouldn't meet his eyes. Past residents who turned away. Through a lobby where staff whispered and pointed. The news vans were already outside, someone had leaked the story, and cameras flashed as federal agents guided him into a sedan. Back inside the conference room, Morrison was frantically dialing. His voice was high and desperate. We need to find Ms. Sullivan immediately. Full reinstatement, back pay, formal apology, whatever it takes. The attorney cut him off. Senior Chief Sullivan, sir. And I believe the Navy has other plans. Brooke's son looked at Commander Vance. His eyes were wet but his voice was steady. "Where is she?" Vance pulled out her phone. When she looked back at the boy, there was something like a smile at the corner of her mouth. "Making a call." She dialed, stepped into the hallway, and spoke 3 words that would have meant nothing to anyone else in that room. "We found your son." A pause. Then, "Now let us find you." 6 months later, Brooke walked past a strip mall in downtown Raleigh. Her stride was different now, no longer the careful hunching of invisibility, no longer the way she'd learned to make herself small. This was the walk of someone who had carried people through burning buildings, who had run toward danger when everyone else ran away, who had decided to stop disappearing. Through the window of a storefront, she saw him. Dr. Sterling. Sitting at a folding table beneath a banner so faded you could barely read it, "Cut Rate Insurance, Auto Home Alive." He was in a cheap suit, the kind that didn't fit right, selling policies to people who passed without stopping. A court-ordered restitution job while awaiting trial on 17 federal counts. His smile was plastered on, desperate, the smile of a man who had forgotten how to be anything but desperate. He looked up. Their eyes met for exactly 1 second. His smile collapsed. Brooke didn't slow down, didn't acknowledge him, just kept walking. The kind of erasure he had tried to inflict on her, now reflected back, permanent and complete. She continued 2 blocks to the Naval Medical Center, Raleigh. The building was modern, all glass and clean lines, the Navy's commitment to taking care of its own. Her new ID badge caught the light as she scanned it at security, Senior Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan, RN, Trauma Department. The rank was there now. Not hidden. Not erased. Visible to everyone. Inside the training room, she joined Vance and Hayes for a briefing. 23 sailors sat in rows of chairs, corpsmen in training, the next generation who would carry medical kits into places where the rules of physics seemed to change. Her son sat in the front row, 17 now, his face holding a pride so evident it was almost luminous. Hayes, fully recovered, his color back and his strength returned, addressed the class. His voice was the voice of command, of a man who had been saved and knew exactly who had done the saving. Your instructor today is Senior Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan. She has 11 combat rescues and she carried me through a burning hospital while the Navy couldn't reach me. Listen to every word she says. Brooke stepped forward. The faded unit patch that had been sewn inside her jacket lining for 6 years, the patch from her team, from Tikrit, from the operation she had given up her identity to survive, was now displayed openly on her uniform. Her voice was steady and clear, no more whispers, no more deferential softness. This was the voice of a senior chief, precise, authoritative, completely certain. You do not need a badge or a gun to be a warrior. You need skill, courage, and the will to run toward danger when others run away. She paused, letting that settle. That's what we do. That's who we are. She moved to the demonstration table and prepared the equipment for needle decompression, the same procedure she had performed in the dark on Hayes while smoke filled the ICU. The same procedure that had saved his life. Her hands were absolutely steady as she positioned the needle, as she explained the anatomy, as she showed them how to find the landmark, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. You have maybe 90 seconds before cardiac arrest. The hiss of escaping air means you got it. That sound means you just saved someone's life. Outside the window, an American flag snapped in the wind, the kind of wind that comes before the weather changes, before storms move through. But inside, in the steady light of the classroom, Brooke Sullivan taught the next generation how to keep people alive. The camera would linger on her scars, visible now on her wrists where she rolled up her sleeves, visible in the way she moved with the precision of someone who had learned medicine in the hardest possible places. Visible in her eyes, which held the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. Her son watched from the front row, understanding now what she had given up, understanding now what she had chosen. And somewhere downtown, in a strip mall window, a man sold insurance to people who walked past without stopping, which was exactly what he deserved. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your story, drop a comment below. And subscribe for more stories about the quiet heroes you walk past every single day. They're out there. Sometimes pushing mops, sometimes saving lives in the dark, sometimes teaching the next generation how to be brave.